I think a lot of British soldiers that served time in Northern Ireland didn't know how there was a Northern Ireland and a Southern Ireland. The history was never explained to them. Why we had two separate countries? So in this video, I'd like to talk about what I've read about and ask questions to Irishmen. In around 1912, the British Parliament came to the conclusion, and just conclusion, that Ireland was a country in its own right with democracy and deserved home rule. So British democratically elected government had no problems wanting a home rule for the whole of Ireland, all 32 counties. So a bill was introduced so that home rule could be given to Ireland. Unfortunately, in the House of Lords it was rejected. Remembering the House of Lords is very undemocratic, in my opinion. It's not put there by the British people. So after the rejection, the bill was presented again, and again the House of Lords rejected the bill. So because the government wanted to go forward, they made new Lords so that on the third reading of the bill it could get passed. In the meantime, in the north, they weren't too happy about being governed by Rome, is what their opinion was. And in the south, they weren't too happy about the north rejecting the idea of home rule for the whole of Ireland. So the north had the Ulster Volunteers assemble, men of military age marching up and down, but they didn't have guns at the time. The south did the equivalent. They had the Irish Volunteers. So the Germans put the finger in the pie. Convenient. 1912, the war started in 1914. So guns were given to the Southern Irish, Mauser rifles and ammunition. Hundreds and hundreds of rifles. And rifles were given to the Ulster Defence Regiments. Ulster Volunteer Force, sorry. So both sides were being given weapons by the Germans. My first question, who paid for the weapons? Can any Irishman tell me that question? Or was payment in kind? The British government ignored, I think it was Sir Edward Carson's objections, and on the third time, home rule was passed for Ireland, all 32 counties, and everybody celebrated by having bonfires all over Ireland. Home rule. But what happened? The First World War. So the government had to put everything on hold until we fought the First World War, 1914 to 1918. My next point in question to the Irish, on the Easter uprising 1916, was that a second front for the Germans? And is that how you paid in kind for the rifles? I'd like a genuine answer from Irish people on that question. Okay, so we've established that the British wanted an island, an independent, self-governing island. We didn't hate the Irish. We wanted to give you home rule. 1916, when we're involved in the First World War fighting the Germans, the Irish decided to have the Easter Rising. The Easter Rising, and the rebels took over Dublin and the post office in Dublin and set up ambushes on the roads leading from the docks to Dublin. Now, the British didn't have a force near Dublin, as they had to send over 1,600 men from the Foresters Regiment, who they sent over by ferry. When they arrived, they were welcomed. They expected to be shot at from the docks, but no. The people leading all the way to Dublin had the English flags waving, give the lads tea and sandwiches, and were happy to see the British Army. The officers went to lunch. So some posh people took them to lunch for teas and scones. So it lowered down the tension. But as they marched to Dublin and came to the first bridge crossing, they were ambushed. Now, the rebels weren't in great numbers, but Jesus, they were professional soldiers. They were lying on tables, windows slightly open, so that you're not going to see the muzzle flashes. They weren't hanging out the window like an amateur. They were professional. The rifles were zeroed in. You got a new rifle, you got to zero it in. So these guys were no amateurs. So my next question is, who trained them guys? Going a little bit further in this conversation, was the uprising to help the Germans making a second front? Was that the idea of the uprising in 1916? Nearly 200 Foresters soldiers were killed and wounded in this ambush leading into Dublin. A massacre, you could say. Somebody had told the officers that the headquarters of the rebels was in a local school, and the officers sent the men, bayonet charging, running up the streets to attack the school. The rebels hadn't told the caretaker and his wife, because they had died in these attacks on the school. But the rebels, as the soldiers were running up to attack the school, were cutting them down by enfilade and defilade fire. That's firing down the street and side on, getting them in a crossfire. And they were mowing down them soldiers left, right and centre. They were not amateurs. They knew what they were doing and how to do a fantastic ambush. Very professional. Not a thick paddy there. So what happened next? The officers and the soldiers were totally demoralized, losing so many men. Doctors and nurses came out from a local hospital and on the white flag took away the wounded and dead off the streets. But then the firing started again. Not giving the nurses time to get out of it, but I don't think there was any nurses hit by the fire. The officers had to send for reinforcements because they'd only arrived with rifles and the odd machine gun. So they couldn't, the post office was where the telegraph was, and the only other one was in the railway station. So they had to send officers to the railway station and ask Belfast, was the uprising happening there as well? Belfast reported no. And in Belfast, they had 50,000 soldiers under training to fight the Germans. So, was it Protestant troops that came down and helped the foresters quell the rebellion? That's my next question. Artillery was brought in, machine guns. Eventually, the ambush. Most of the rebels got out of the ambush, and some were captured, who would be later shot. But I'll get on to that. So, my main question is, was this a second front for the Germans? It certainly was a kick in the teeth for all the members of Parliament and the British people that supported to give the Irish Home Rule. And really, the uprising stopped it. Is that a fact? The situation when the post office was taken, the rebels were jeered by the Dublin people, by the Irish people. So many Irish soldiers were fighting on the side of the British, fighting the Germans. So the Irish didn't like the rebellion either. But as the MPs had a kick in the teeth and a backstabbing, could they trust the Irish anymore? And is this the reason why after the war the promises were broken, the Black and Tans were formed, and all Irish were treated with suspicion of being rebels? So really, did the Irish Easter Rising 1916, was it good for the Irish? My opinion, no. I'd like your opinion. The promises were broken. The Irish didn't get the 32 counties. In 6 counties, Collins could only negotiate a separation of North and South, which in fact caused the Irish Civil War. But the promises were broken, maybe because of the Irish doing the rebellion. I'd like your opinion. Talking about the problems and the reasons is why I make my videos. I might be right. The whole idea is to talk to you. Irish people, North, South, and English people. You see the comments I get. I get extreme comments. I get some idiots. But in general, English people love the Irish and vice versa. So if we could talk about it, we may solve the problem and have a united Ireland in the future. But not under Gerry Adams, eh? That's another talking point.